I struggle with that as a surgeon because sometimes I oscillate between that hero and that zero. You know, you do everything right, you do the same thing, techniques, same tools, and yet one does really well and one has a bad outcome. How do we understand that? You know, and even in your writing, how do we filter that? You know, sometimes it seems like we write something and it just seems to be like a total flop. And sometimes the things that we think that, you know, really aren't that good, people just seem to love. Have you ever had that experience? Yes. And so I want to just introduce to you something, that there's a better way. Just to take courage. There's a better way to see yourself as a writer. A better way than seeing yourself as a victim or a zero or a hero. And that's what I call a third level thinker. It's a framework of thinking that's very different and introduces a different element into the equation. It's not a term. It's not something that adds and subtracts. You see, this multiplies this factor. Okay, once again, I'm mathematically challenged, but deal with me here. When we bring God into the equation, it does a lot of things. It changes the whole equation. But I think the thing that distinguishes Christianity from every other worldview, from every other spirituality, is something that makes it very unique, and that's grace. The fact that God does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. It even goes beyond that. That's really not even a good description of what grace is. I mean, that's even an inadequate description of grace. But I want you to think about adding this term into the equation. First of all, grace changes everything. It changes the whole equation in the way that we think about ourselves as writers. So this is what I think the equation looks like here. See how grace influences. And I've got a pointer if you notice. Notice how grace changes the outcome. How it objectifies the outcomes based upon absolutes. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to break this down. But how grace enhances our response on a deeper level. How grace changes the way that we see our circumstances. This is an adequate definition of grace, but grace, God doing for us what we can't do for ourselves. We know based upon the completed work of Christ, right, that God has done something for us and has already appropriated an outcome for our lives. Even in our writing, even that small part of our life maybe that we call writing, that God has a destiny and an objective and a purpose for our writing. Isn't that great news?
Yes, it is.
So, I want to talk a little bit about how grace changes the outcome. So understand this objectifies the outcome, is that God has a specific purpose for our writing. So it's always purposeful. It's God honoring, right? In the third level, who gets the credit? God gets the credit. Who gets the honor? God does. And so it's also for our benefit and for the others and for the benefit of others. It's always objective and fair. You know, we all have these circumstances in our lives that sometimes just don't make sense, but understand that the outcome is always fair from God's perspective. And that's one of the things about the difference between social justice and from God's understanding of His biblical view of justice, that someday all of the wrongs are going to be righted. So, you know, whether God brings us out or whether God brings us through, I think this is on your handout, either way we win. Isn't that good news?
Yes.
Isn't that good news about us as writing? Whether our book is 8,644,832 on the Amazon bestseller list, or whether it's number one, that God is going to either bring us out or bring us through. Either way, we win. And this is a picture of my family. I have 5 kids. And this is, of course, Joanna, my wife. She's here. I tell folks, I'm the best guy to see on the worst day of your life. Joanna is the best person to see any day of your life. I mean, we go to baseball games and stuff, and everybody kind of flocks around Joanna. Now, when they see me, they're like, oh, that's him. And they go the other direction. But Joanna's awesome. And so this is number 3, Georgia Ann. And Georgia, and this is an outcome I never expected. I never expected this outcome. Georgia Ann is now illustrating a children's book with me called Climbing the Upside Down Tree, about 2 little boys in Africa and One is living by performance-based acceptance, and the one is kind of learned the hard way through some mistakes to ask his dad for help. And she's making, and you know, never in my mind would I have thought of that outcome. So often, God's outcome for our lives is very different than the outcome that we desire, based upon that second level. God has sometimes a different goal for our writing. And so then I think about number 4. This is Jane Aubrey Rose. Now, Jane Aubrey Rose is our senior. She's a homeschooled kid, smart, writing her first novel.
Wow.
And then, I'm not going to embarrass Joanna today, but Joanna wrote a poem for a friend that we had that just died in the funeral, and it was the most amazing poem I've ever read. I'm like, wow, Joanna, why don't you get up here and do this today? But I'm just saying, thinking about this in our lives, sometimes as writers, we have this objective, we have this purpose that we think that we want God to do. And often, God has a very different objective for our lives. And so the question is getting in line with what God's doing in our writing.